DevelopSec, Developing Security Awareness with James Jardine, brought to you by Jardine Software. Hey everyone, this is James with DevelopSec Podcast. Today I want to talk a little bit about validation. And when I talk about validation, I'm talking about client side versus server side. A lot of times we hear people talk about wanting to validate data just on the client, talk about just validating on the server. I'm going to talk about how we validate on both sides and why it is that we do that and what benefits we get. I remember years ago, probably 10 years ago at least, I was doing an interview for a senior developer position, and the interviewer on the phone call asked me where I should do validation, whether it should be on the client or the server. Now, my response was server because, well, that's where I do validation, and I'm pretty sure that's where it should be done. And, at that time, the response was, no, Microsoft recommends that it should be done on the client, which I didn't really fully believe because I don't think Microsoft would say just that. But, we moved on past that. And as of recent, I've been starting to get people asking more questions about when we talk about validation, server side versus client side. And one of the big questions that comes up is, well, should I be doing more validation client side because it helps remove some of the performance requirement from the server, right? I can offload that work down to the client. And, we're seeing a lot more thicker clients, if you will, even in the web browser with the use of JavaScript, that we can do this validation on the client before we send it up, right? It's a lot quicker. Well, that is true, but we really still need to do validation on the server. So let's kind of talk about both of those for a moment. When we talk about client-side validation, right, typically we have some sort of form and we're inputting data into that. So maybe we have an email address that we want to make sure fits the pattern of an email address. Maybe we've got some other fields that we want to make sure, are actually filled in, right? They're required fields. Maybe we have integers that have to be a certain thing, right? Like, so I'm ordering a number of items from my cart. I need to make sure that I'm actually requiring that that number is positive and not a negative number. There's lots of things we can do with validation. And when we do it on the client, it works well, right? Typically we use JavaScript and we can validate that all these requirements are met before we send the data to the server. The thing we have to realize, though, is that we can intercept that data after the client-side validation has occurred before it gets to the server. Now, I'm not talking about the guy sitting in the coffee shop that's hacking the network and trying to do this. I'm talking about people using the system themselves, right? I can run a web proxy, something like Burp Suite or Fiddler or Zap Proxy. And when I do this, it runs after everything in the browser. Once the browser sends it out on the network, it'll send it to this proxy first, and then I can change the values that were submitted. So maybe I put in a valid email address because that's what the JavaScript required, but then once it got past that, I changed it. I said, all right, I've been past validation. I'm going to change it to SQL injection, and I'm going to pass a SQL injection payload up in place of that email address and send it on to the server. So in cases like this, if the server isn't doing validation, then we've now bypassed that. And if we're also not doing other checks on the server and protecting our applications in depth, well, now we may be vulnerable to different issues. In this example, SQL injection. So we always need to make sure that we have that validation on the server side to make sure that we're validating this data as it comes up. And the reason for this is we're crossing a trust boundary. So if you've done any threat modeling, we talk a lot about trust boundaries. And going from an end user up to the server, that's a trust boundary. I don't know what happened before the data got to my web server. So I need to make sure that I validate the data is what I expect it to be for my application because I don't know what happened. Same thing when we talk about going from our application to a database, right? There's a trust boundary there. And so I don't know from my database what happened to that data before it got passed to me. Even though I may trust the application, there's lots of ways data get into a database. So there's a trust boundary. So we need to make sure that we're performing the validation how we want to do it. Now, when you look at things like a SQL Server, right, we have validation at that point when we talk about things like parameterized queries, and we go in and specify that my data is a certain type, or we specify that it's a certain length, right? If I go and set, hey, this is a varchar 255, I'm doing some amount of validation there that it is only limited to 255 characters. If I do a date time field, right, I'm validating that the data is of that type before I allow it to be brought up into my system. So you can see we're doing validation there. Same thing, traffic coming into our web server. Am I doing the validation when it hits my web server? Now, again, we go back to a performance thing. You might think, well, that could be a performance issue on my server. So with all these thick clients, why don't I move that down to the client? And I'm not saying don't do client-side validation. As a matter of fact, I recommend doing client-side validation, right? That is a user experience feature that allows quick reaction times, right? When I'm in there, it gives me a full, thick client feel that I'm not waiting for a request to go up to the server and come back down. I get immediate response. So if I didn't fill in that field and I try to submit the form, it tells me right away. I don't have to wait for the round trip. If I didn't put in an email address that doesn't match the right pattern, I don't have to wait for that to go up and do a round trip to the server, decide whether it was valid or not, send it back down, possibly, clear out my fields, right? It's a real big pain sometimes. So that client-side validation serves a huge purpose of making sure that we're protecting that side and saying, hey, look, I want to make sure this is ease of use for the user. It's quick. They want a good experience. That's what we're looking for there. But we have to remember that while we're cutting down there, we still have to do that on the server side. And this does help with performance, because if I can stop 50% of my requests that go up because they're not ready, well, that's a 50% less payload onto my server. So that's the goal there, is that I'm actually limiting the number of actual requests that will go through validation once it hits my server. And keep in mind that oftentimes the validation that gets past all that, right, when we go through, and I say I bypass validation, that's not very common from our normal users. I'm not talking about the people that are there trying to test our apps or hack our apps, but the normal users of our application aren't trying to bypass the JavaScript that exists there. They're just going ahead and running along and using the application. They'll get their immediate feedback, and it sends up to the server, and then the server will then validate it to make sure it's fine. Now, if you do have performance issues with validation on the server, you may want to recheck what you're doing for validation on the server. Oftentimes, we may run into an issue where we're trying to do too much validation. So make sure that you understand the validation you're doing. I try to limit validation down to simple things, right? The type of data that's coming in, the range of that data, right? If it can only be positive numbers, make sure that it's only positive numbers. These are the type of things. Length of that data that's coming through, limiting that down. I'm not trying to look for every potential cross-site scripting payload or every potential SQL injection payload, right? I've got other mechanisms in place that are going to help with that. But I need to understand what my data is, have it defined, so I can validate that the data coming up matches that definition. Then as it traverses through our system, we're going to do different things to it, right? It comes in. Now when I go to SQL Server, I'm going to run parameterized queries. If it's going back out to the browser, I'm going to do contextually sensitive output encoding to make sure that I'm protecting it as it goes out, right? So it's a ecosystem of different things that we're doing to help protect against these vulnerabilities. We're not just relying on the input validation, which is something that commonly is misunderstood. Now, what about mobile applications, right? We think about those. Those are very much so a thicker client, typically. They're not necessarily just a web app built into the application of the device, right? These are actually running on native application programming languages. So, in iOS, whether it's Android, they're actually running natively. It's not just an encased web browser. So even with these, you might think, well, how can I get in the middle of that and bypass that? Well, the answer is typically it's the same way, right? I mean, I can do it with a proxy because most of these applications, if they're communicating out to the server, they're communicating over HTTP or HTTPS, and I can throw that same proxy in the middle, and I can intercept that traffic, and I can then manipulate it and affect it on the server side. Now, if you're talking just in the app, it's a thick client, it doesn't talk out to a server, well, then obviously you're doing client-side validation because the client is kind of the server at that point. But if it's going out to an actual server, we need to make sure that we're validating it on the server because, again, we're crossing that trust boundary. Typically, we're using APIs. I don't know who's calling that API. So I can't assume that there's any validation from a server perspective on the client because I don't know what the client is. That's the purpose of an API, right? Is that I don't have that. So we want to make sure that we're always doing that server side. But client side is important, right? And it's a matter of, just like everything we do when we talk about security, is understand the context and the purpose of why we're doing these different things. And when we look at it, client side is there to make it UI accessible, make it easy, make it fast for the end user. Server-side validation is there more from a security perspective, that I'm making sure I can't bypass any of that. So if I know that an email address has to come up as an email address pattern, that I'll check it to make sure that it does match that pattern. Nobody manipulated it before it got to me. That doesn't mean that some fields may still not have, malicious code in them, but we're doing our best to limit that down and match the definitions for the input that we provided. So hopefully this provides some good insight into client-side versus server-side validation. Remember, it's a mixture of both, but from a security perspective, we have to make sure that we're validating on the server past the point where anybody can manipulate that data before it gets to us. So I appreciate everybody listening. You might see we tried something new here. We're trying out a little video with this as well. So if you're just listening to strictly the podcast, I'll put in the show notes where you can get the video for this. Trying to see if this, makes any difference, reach some different people that maybe like watching things on YouTube instead of just listening to the podcast. So let me know. Send me your feedback. As always, you can reach me at james@developsec.com or on Twitter. You can reach us at developsec on Twitter. So reach out. Let us know what you think. We appreciate everybody that listens, and we'll talk to everybody on the next episode.
You have been listening to the DevelopSec podcast with James Jardine. Follow us on Twitter at DevelopSec and visit our website at www.developsec.com for more episodes and information.